Who Rules the World? By Noam Chomsky. Introduction. The question raised by the title of this book cannot have a simple and definite answer. The world is too varied, too complex, for that to be possible. But it is not hard to recognize the sharp differences in ability to shape world affairs, and to identify the more prominent and influential actors. Among states, since the end of World War II, the United States has been by far the first among unequals, and remains so. It still largely sets the terms for global discourse, ranging from such concerns as Israel-Palestine, Iran, Latin America, the War on Terror, International Economic Organization, rights and justice, and others like them, to the ultimate issues of survival of civilization, nuclear war and environmental destruction. Its power, however, has been diminishing since it reached a historically unprecedented peak in 1945. And with the inevitable decline, Washington's power is to some extent shared within the de facto world government of the masters of the universe, to borrow the terms of the business press, referring to the leading state capitalist powers, the G7 countries, along with the institutions they control in the new imperial age, such as the International Monetary Fund and the global trade organizations. The masters of the universe are of course very far from representative of the populations of the dominant powers. Even in the more democratic states, the populations have only limited impact on policy decisions. In the United States, prominent researchers have produced compelling evidence that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. The results of their studies, the authors conclude, provide substantial support for theories of economic elite domination and for theories of biased pluralism, but not for theories of majoritarian electoral democracy or majoritarian pluralism. Other studies have demonstrated that the large majority of the population, at the lower end of the income/wealth scale, are effectively excluded from the political system, their opinions and attitudes ignored by their formal representatives, while a tiny sector at the top has overwhelming influence, and that over a long period. Campaign funding is a remarkably good predictor of policy choices. 21 Consequence is so-called apathy, not bothering to vote. It has a significant class correlation. Likely reasons were discussed 35 years ago by one of the leading scholars of electoral politics, Walter Dean Burnham. He related abstention to a crucial comparative peculiarity of the American political system, the total absence of a socialist or laborite mass party as an organized competitor in the electoral market, which, he argued, accounts for much of the class-skewed abstention rates, as well as the downplaying of policy options that may be supported by the general population but are opposed to elite interests. The observations reach to the present. In a close analysis of the 2014 election, Burnham and Thomas Ferguson show that rates of voting recall the earliest days of the 19th century, when voting rights were virtually restricted to propertied-free males. They conclude that both direct poll evidence and common sense confirm that huge numbers of Americans are now wary of both major political parties and increasingly upset about prospects in the long term. Many are convinced that a few big interests control policy. They crave effective action to reverse long-term economic decline and runaway economic inequality, but nothing on the scale required will be offered to them by either of America's money-driven major parties. This is likely only to accelerate the disintegration of the political system evident in the 2014 congressional elections. In Europe, the decline of democracy is no less striking, as decision-making on crucial issues is shifted to the Brussels bureaucracy and the financial powers that it largely represents. Their contempt for democracy was revealed in the savage reaction in July 2015 to the very idea that the people of Greece might have a voice in determining the fate of their society, shattered by the brutal austerity policies of the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, specifically the IMF's political actors, not its economists, who have been critical of the destructive policies. These austerity policies were imposed with the stated goal of reducing Greece's debt. Yet they have in fact increased the debt relative to GDP, while Greek social fabric has been torn to shreds, and Greece has served as a funnel to transmit bailouts to French and German banks that made risky loans. There are few surprises here. Class war, typically one-sided, has a long and bitter history. At the dawn of the modern state capitalist era, Adam Smith condemned the masters of mankind of his day, the merchants and manufacturers of England, who were, by far the principal architects of policy, and who made sure their own interests were most peculiarly attended to, no matter how grievous the effect on others, primarily the victims of their savage injustice abroad, but much of the population of England as well. The neoliberal era of the past generation has added its own touches to this classic picture, with the masters drawn from the top ranks of increasingly monopolized economies, the gargantuan and often predatory financial institutions, the multinationals protected by state power, and the political figures who largely represent their interests. Meanwhile, scarcely a day passes without new reports of ominous scientific discoveries about the pace of environmental destruction. It is not too comforting to read that, in the middle latitudes of the northern hemisphere, average temperatures are increasing at a rate that is equivalent to moving south about 10 meters, 30 feet, each day, a rate about 100 times faster than most climate change that we can observe in the geological record, and perhaps 1,000 times faster, according to other technical studies. No less grim is the growing threat of nuclear war. The well-informed former Defense Secretary William Perry, no Cassandra, regards the probability of a nuclear calamity as higher today than during the Cold War, when escape from unimaginable disaster was a near miracle. Meanwhile, the great powers doggedly pursue their programs of national insecurity, in the apt phrase of longtime CIA analyst Melvin Goodman. Perry is also one of those specialists who called on President Obama to kill the new cruise missile, a nuclear weapon with improved targeting and lower yield that might encourage limited nuclear war, quickly escalating by familiar dynamics to utter disaster. Worse yet, the new missile has both nuclear and non-nuclear variants, so that a foe under attack might assume the worst and overreact, initiating nuclear war. But there is little reason to expect that the advice will be heeded, as the Pentagon's planned $1 trillion enhancement of nuclear weapons systems proceeds apace, while lesser powers take their own steps towards Armageddon. The foregoing remarks seem to me to sketch a fair approximation to the cast of primary characters. The chapters that follow seek to explore the question of who rules the world, how they proceed in their efforts, and where these lead, and how the underlying populations, to borrow Thorstein Veblen's useful phrase, may hope to overcome the power of business and nationalist doctrine and become, in his words, alive and fit to live. There is not much time. Chapter 1, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, Redux. Before thinking about the responsibility of intellectuals, it is worth clarifying to whom we are referring. The concept of intellectuals, in the modern sense, gained prominence with the 1898 Manifesto of the Intellectuals, produced by the Dreyfusards, who, inspired by Émile Zola's open letter of protest to France's president, condemned both the framing of French artillery officer Alfred Dreyfus for treason and the subsequent military cover-up. The Dreyfusard stance conveys the image of intellectuals as defenders of justice, confronting power with courage and integrity. But they were hardly seen that way at the time. A minority of the educated classes, the Dreyfusards, were bitterly condemned in the mainstream of intellectual life, in particular by prominent figures among the immortals of the strongly anti-Dreyfusard Académie Française, as sociologist Stephen Lukes writes. To the novelist, politician, and anti-Dreyfusard leader Maurice Barrès, Dreyfusards were anarchists of the lecture platform. To another of these immortals, Ferdinand Brunetière, the very word intellectual signified one of the most ridiculous eccentricities of our time, I mean the pretension of raising writers, scientists, professors and philologists to the rank of supermen, who dare to treat our generals as idiots, our social institutions as absurd and our traditions as unhealthy. Who then were the intellectuals? The minority inspired by Zola, who was sentenced to jail for libel and fled the country, or the immortals of the Academy? The question resonates through the ages, in one form or another. Intellectuals, two categories. One answer came during World War I, when prominent intellectuals on all sides lined up enthusiastically in support of their own states. In their Manifesto of the 93, leading figures in one of the world's most enlightened states called on the West to have faith in us. Believe that we shall carry on this war to the end as a civilized nation, to whom the legacy of a Goethe, a Beethoven, and a Kant, is just as sacred as its own hearths and homes. To their counterparts on the other side of the intellectual trenches matched them in enthusiasm for the noble cause, but went beyond in self-adulation. In the New Republief they proclaimed that the effective and decisive work on behalf of the war has been accomplished by a class which must be comprehensively but loosely described as the intellectuals. These progressives believed they were ensuring that the United States entered the war under the influence of a moral verdict reached, after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community. They were, in fact, the victims of concoctions of the British Ministry of Information, which secretly sought to direct the thought of most of the world, but particularly to direct the thought of American progressive intellectuals who might help to whip a pacifist country into war fever. John Dewey was impressed by the great psychological and educational lesson of the war, which proved that human beings, more precisely, the intelligent men of the community, can take hold of human affairs and manage them, deliberately and intelligently, to achieve the ends sought. Point 4. It took Dewey only a few years to shift from responsible intellectual of World War I to anarchist of the lecture platform, denouncing the unfree press and questioning how far genuine intellectual freedom and social responsibility are possible on any large scale under the existing economic regime. Not everyone toed the line so obediently, of course. Notable figures such as Bertrand Russell, Eugene Debs, Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht were, like Zola, sentenced to prison. Debs was punished with particular severity, a 10-year prison term for raising questions about President Wilson's War for Democracy and Human Rights. Wilson refused him amnesty after the war ended, though President Harding finally relented. Some dissidents, such as Thorstein Veblen, were chastised but treated less harshly. Veblen was fired from his position in the Food Administration after preparing a report showing that the shortage of farm labor could be overcome by ending Wilson's brutal persecution of unions, specifically the industrial workers of the world. Randolph Bourne was dropped by the progressive journals after criticizing the League of Benevolently Imperialistic Nations and their exalted endeavors. The pattern of praise and punishment is a familiar one throughout history. Those who line up in the service of the state are typically praised by the general intellectual community, and those who refuse to line up in service of the state are punished. In later years, the two categories of intellectuals were distinguished more explicitly by prominent scholars. The ridiculous eccentrics are termed value-oriented intellectuals, who pose a challenge to democratic government which is, potentially at least, as serious as those posed in the past by aristocratic cliques, fascist movements, and communist parties. Among other misdeeds, these dangerous creatures devote themselves to the derogation of leadership, the challenging of authority, and even confront the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Some sink so far as to doubt the nobility of war aims, like Bourne. This castigation of the miscreants who defy authority and the established order was delivered by the scholars of the Liberal Internationalist Trilateral Commission. The Carter administration was largely drawn from their ranks, in their 1975 study The Crisis of Démographie. Like the New Republief progressives during the First World War, they extend the concept of intellectual beyond Brunetière to include the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, responsible and serious thinkers who devote themselves to the constructive work of shaping policy within established institutions, and to ensuring that indoctrination of the young proceeds on course. What particularly alarmed the trilateral scholars was the excess of democracy during the time of troubles, the 1960s, when normally passive and apathetic parts of the population entered the political arena to advance their concerns: minorities, women, the young, the old, working people, in short, the population, sometimes called the special interests. They are to be distinguished from those whom Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, who are the principal architects of government policy and who pursue their vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for other people. The role of the masters in the political arena is not deplored, or discussed, in the trilateral volume, presumably because the masters represent the national interest, like those who applauded themselves for leading the country to war, after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community had reached its moral verdict. To overcome the excessive burden imposed on the state by the special interests, the trilateralists called for more moderation in democracy, a return to passivity on the part of the less deserving, perhaps even a return to the happy days when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, and democracy therefore flourished. The trilateralists could well have claimed that they were adhering to the original intent of the Constitution, intrinsically an aristocratic document designed to check the democratic tendencies of the period, by delivering power to a better sort of people and barring those who were not rich, well-born, or prominent from exercising political power, in the words of the historian Gordon Wood. In Madison's defense, however, we should recognize that his mentality was pre-capitalist. In determining that power should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, he envisioned those men on the model of the enlightened statesman and benevolent philosopher of the imagined Roman world. They would be pure and noble, men of intelligence, patriotism, property, and independent circumstances, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So endowed, these men would refine and enlarge the public views, guarding the public interest against the mischiefs of democratic majorities. In a similar vein, the progressive Wilsonian intellectuals might have taken comfort in the discoveries of the behavioral sciences, explained in 1939 by the psychologist and education theorist Edward Thorndike. It is the great good fortune of mankind that there is a substantial correlation between intelligence and morality, including goodwill toward one's fellows. Consequently, our superiors in ability are on the average our benefactors, and it is often safer to trust our interests to them than to ourselves. A comforting doctrine, though some might feel that Adam Smith had the sharper eye. Reversing the values. The distinction between the two categories of intellectuals provides the framework for determining the responsibility of intellectuals. The phrase is ambiguous. Does it refer to their moral responsibility as decent human beings, in a position to use their privilege and status to advance the causes of freedom, justice, mercy, peace, and other such sentimental concerns? Or does it refer to the role they are expected to play as technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, not derogating but serving leadership and established institutions? Since power generally tends to prevail, it is those in the latter category who are considered the responsible intellectuals, while the former are dismissed or denigrated, at home, that is. With regard to enemies, the distinction between the two categories of intellectuals is retained, but with values reversed. In the old Soviet Union, the value-oriented intellectuals were perceived by Americans as honored dissidents, while we had only contempt for the apparatchiks and commissars, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals. Similarly, in Iran we honor the courageous dissidents and condemn those who defend the clerical establishment. And so on elsewhere generally. In this way, the honorable term dissident is used selectively. It does not, of course, apply, with its favorable connotations, to value-oriented intellectuals at home or to those who combat US-supported tyranny abroad. Take the interesting case of Nelson Mandela, who was only removed from the official State Department terrorist list in 2008, allowing him to travel to the United States without special authorization. 20 years earlier, he was the criminal leader of one of the world's more notorious terrorist groups, according to a Pentagon report. 12 That is why President Reagan had to support the apartheid regime, increasing trade with South Africa in violation of congressional sanctions and supporting South Africa's depredations in neighboring countries, which led, according to a UN study, to 1.5 million deaths. That was only one episode in the war on terrorism that Reagan declared to combat the plague of the modern age, or, as Secretary of State George Shultz had it, a return to barbarism in the modern age. We may add hundreds of thousands of corpses in Central America and tens of thousands more in the Middle East, among other achievements. Small wonder that the great communicator is worshipped by Hoover Institution scholars as a colossus whose spirit seems to stride the country, watching us like a warm and friendly ghost. The Latin American case is revealing. Those who called for freedom and justice in Latin America are not admitted to the pantheon of honored dissidents. For example, a week after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, all Jesuit priests, had their heads blown off on the direct orders of the Salvadoran High Command. The perpetrators were from an elite battalion armed and trained by Washington that had already left a gruesome trail of blood and terror. The murdered priests are not commemorated as honored dissidents, nor are others like them throughout the hemisphere. Honored dissidents are those who called for freedom in enemy domains in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and those thinkers certainly suffered, but not remotely like their counterparts in Latin America. This assertion is not seriously in question, as John Coatsworth writes in the Cambridge History of the Cold War, from 1960 to the Soviet collapse in 1990, the numbers of political prisoners, torture victims, and executions of non-violent political dissenters in Latin America vastly exceeded those in the Soviet Union and its East European satellites. Among the executed were many religious martyrs, and there were mass slaughters as well, consistently supported or initiated by Washington. Why then the distinction? It might be argued that what happened in Eastern Europe matters far more than the fate of the global South at our hands. It would be interesting to see that argument spelled out, and also to see the argument explaining why we should disregard elementary moral principles in thinking about U.S. involvement in foreign affairs, among them that we should focus our efforts on where we can do the most good, typically, where we share responsibility for what is being done. We have no difficulty demanding that our enemies follow such principles. Few of us care, or should, what Andrei Sakharov or Shirin Ebadi says about U.S. or Israeli crimes. We admire them for what they say and do about those of their own states, and this conclusion holds far more strongly for those who live in more free and democratic societies, and therefore have far greater opportunities to act effectively. It is of some interest that, in the most respected circles, the practice is virtually the opposite of what elementary moral values dictate. The U.S. wars in Latin America from 1960 to 1990, quite apart from their horrors, have long-term historical significance. To consider just one important aspect, they were in no small measure wars against the Catholic Church, undertaken to crush a terrible heresy proclaimed at Vatican II in 1962. At that time, Pope John XXII ushered in a new era in the history of the Catholic Church, in the words of the distinguished theologian Hans Kung, restoring the teachings of the Gospels that had been put to rest in the 4th century when the Emperor Constantine established Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, thereby instituting a revolution that converted the persecuted church to a persecuting church. The heresy of Vatican II was taken up by Latin American bishops, who adopted the preferential option for the poor. Priests, nuns, and laypersons then brought the radical pacifist message of the Gospels to the poor, helping them organize to ameliorate their bitter fate in the domains of U.S. power. That same year, 1962, President John F. Kennedy made several critical decisions. One was to shift the mission of the militaries of Latin America from hemispheric defense, an anachronism from World War II, to internal security, in effect, war against the domestic population, if they raised their heads. Charles Machling Jr., who led U.S. counterinsurgency and internal defense planning from 1961 to 1966, describes the unsurprising consequences of the 1962 decision as a shift from toleration of the rapacity and cruelty of the Latin American military to direct complicity in their crimes, to U.S. support for the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. One major initiative was a military coup in Brazil, backed by Washington and implemented shortly after Kennedy's assassination, that instituted a murderous and brutal national security state there. The plague of repression then spread through the hemisphere, encompassing the 1973 coup that installed the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile and later the most vicious of all, the Argentine dictatorship, Ronald Reagan's favorite Latin American regime. Central America's turn, not for the first time, came in the 1980s under the leadership of the warm and friendly ghost of the Hoover Institution scholars, who is now revered for his achievements. The murder of the Jesuit intellectuals as the Berlin Wall fell was a final blow in defeating the heresy of liberation theology, the culmination of a decade of horror in El Salvador that opened with the assassination, by much the same hands, of Archbishop Oscar Romero, the voice for the voiceless. The victors in the war against the Church declared their responsibility with pride. The School of the Americas, since renamed, famous for its training of Latin American killers, announced as one of its talking points that the liberation theology initiated at Vatican II was defeated with the assistance of the U.S. Army. Actually, the November 1989 assassinations were almost a final blow, more effort was yet needed. A year later Haiti had its first free election, and to the surprise and shock of Washington, which had anticipated an easy victory for its own candidate, hand-picked from the privileged elite, the organized public in the slums and hills elected Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a popular priest committed to liberation theology. The United States at once moved to undermine the elected government and, after the military coup that overthrew it a few months later, lent substantial support to the vicious military junta and its elite supporters who took power. Trade with Haiti was increased, in violation of international sanctions, and increased further under President Clinton, who also authorized the Texaco Oil Company to supply the murderous rulers, in defiance of his own directives. I will skip the disgraceful aftermath, amply reviewed elsewhere, except to point out that in 2004, the two traditional torturers of Haiti, France and the United States, joined by Canada, forcefully intervened once more, kidnapped President Aristide, who had been elected again, and shipped him off to Central Africa. Aristide and his party were then effectively barred from the farcical 2010-11 elections, the most recent episode in a horrendous history that goes back hundreds of years and is barely known among those responsible for the crimes, who prefer tales of dedicated efforts to save the suffering people from their grim fate. Another fateful Kennedy decision in 1962 was to send a Special Forces mission, led by General William Yarborough, to Colombia. Yarborough advised the Colombian security forces to undertake paramilitary, sabotage and/or terrorist activities against known communist proponents, activities that should be backed by the United States. The meaning of the phrase, communist proponents, was spelled out by the respected president of the Colombian Permanent Committee for Human Rights, former Minister of Foreign Affairs Alfredo Vasquez Carrizosa, who wrote that the Kennedy administration took great pains to transform our regular armies into counterinsurgency brigades, accepting the new strategy of the death squads, ushering in what is known in Latin America as the national security doctrine. Not defense against an external enemy, but a way to make the military establishment the masters of the game. With the right to combat the internal enemy, as set forth in the Brazilian doctrine, the Argentine doctrine, the Uruguayan doctrine, and the Colombian doctrine, it is the right to fight and to exterminate social workers, trade unionists, men and women who are not supportive of the establishment, and who are assumed to be communist extremists. And this could mean anyone, including human rights activists such as myself. Vasquez Carrizosa was living under heavy guard in his Bogotá residence when I visited him there in 2002 as part of a mission of Amnesty International, which was opening its year-long campaign to protect human rights defenders in Colombia in response to the country's horrifying record of attacks against human rights and labor activists and mostly the usual victims of state terror, the poor and defenseless. Terror and torture in Colombia were supplemented by chemical warfare, fumigation, in the countryside under the pretext of the war on drugs, leading to misery and a huge flight of the survivors to urban slums. Colombia's Attorney General's office now estimates that more than 140,000 people have been killed by paramilitaries, often acting in close collaboration with the US-funded military. Signs of the slaughter are everywhere. In 2010, on a nearly impassable dirt road to a remote village in southern Colombia, my companions and I passed a small clearing with many simple crosses marking the graves of victims of a paramilitary attack on a local bus. Reports of the killings are graphic enough, spending a little time with the survivors, who are among the kindest and most compassionate people I have ever had the privilege of meeting, makes the picture more vivid, and only more painful. This is merely the briefest sketch of terrible crimes for which Americans bear substantial culpability, and that we could at the very least have easily ameliorated. But it is more gratifying to bask in praise for courageously protesting the abuses of official enemies, a fine activity, but not the priority of a value-oriented intellectual who takes the responsibilities of that stance seriously. The victims within our domains of power, unlike those in enemy states, are not merely ignored and quickly forgotten but are also cynically insulted. One striking illustration of this fact came a few weeks after the murder of the Latin American intellectuals in El Salvador, when Václav Havel visited Washington and addressed a joint session of Congress. Before his enraptured audience, Havel lauded the defenders of freedom in Washington who understood the responsibility that flowed from being the most powerful nation on earth, crucially, their responsibility for the brutal assassination of his Salvadoran counterparts shortly before. The liberal intellectual class was enthralled by his presentation. Havel reminded us that, "We live in a romantic age," Anthony Lewis gushed in the New York Times. Other prominent liberal commentators reveled in Havel's idealism, his irony, his humanity, as he preached a difficult doctrine of individual responsibility, while Congress obviously ached with respect for his genius and integrity and asked why America lacks intellectuals who elevate morality over self-interest. In this way, point 27, we need not tarry on what the reaction would have been had Father Ignacio Ellacuria, the most prominent of the murdered Jesuit intellectuals, spoken such words at the Duma after elite forces armed and trained by the Soviet Union assassinated Havel and half a dozen of his associates, a performance that would, of course, have been inconceivable. Since we can scarcely see what is happening before our eyes, it is not surprising that events at a slight distance are utterly invisible. An instructive example, President Obama's dispatch of 79 commandos into Pakistan in May 2011 to carry out what was evidently a planned assassination of the prime suspect in the terrorist atrocities of 9/11, Osama bin Laden. Though the target of the operation, unarmed and with no protection, could easily have been apprehended, he was simply murdered and his body dumped at sea without an autopsy, an action that was just and necessary, we read in the liberal press. There would be no trial, as there was in the case of Nazi war criminals, a fact not overlooked by legal authorities abroad, who approved of the operation but objected to the procedure. As Harvard professor Elaine Scarry reminds us, the prohibition on assassination in international law traces back to a forceful denunciation of the practice by Abraham Lincoln, who condemned the call for assassination as international outlawry, in 1863, an outrage which civilized nations view with horror and that merits the sternest retaliation. We have come a long way since then. There is much more to say about the bin Laden operation, including Washington's willingness to face a serious risk of major war and even the leakage of nuclear materials to jihadis, as I have discussed elsewhere. But let us keep to the choice of its nomenclature, Operation Geronimo. The name caused outrage in Mexico and was protested by indigenous groups in the United States, but there seems to have been no other notice of the fact that Obama was identifying bin Laden with the Apache Indian chief who led his people's courageous resistance to invaders. The casual choice of the name is reminiscent of the ease with which we name our murder weapons after victims of our crimes, Apache, Blackhawk, Cheyenne. How would we have reacted if the Luftwaffe had called its fighter planes Jew and Gypsy? Denial of these heinous sins is sometimes explicit. To mention a few recent cases, 2 years ago in one of the leading left-liberal intellectual journals, the New York Review of Books, Russell Baker outlined what he had learned from the work of the heroic historian Edmund Morgan, namely, that when Columbus and the early explorers arrived they found a continental vastness sparsely populated by farming and hunting people. In the limitless and unspoiled world stretching from tropical jungle to the frozen north, there may have been scarcely more than 1 million inhabitants. 31 That calculation is off by many tens of millions, and the vastness included advanced civilizations throughout the continent. No reactions appeared, though 4 months later the editors issued a correction, noting that in North America there may have been as many as 18 million people, yet still unmentioned were tens of millions more, from tropical jungle to the frozen north. This was all well known decades ago, including the advanced civilizations and the crimes that were to come, but not important enough even for a casual phrase. In the London Review of Books a year later, the noted historian Mark Mazower mentioned American mistreatment of the Native Americans, again eliciting no comment. Point 32. Would we accept the word mistreatment for comparable crimes committed by our enemies? The significance of 9/11. If the responsibility of intellectuals refers to their moral responsibility as decent human beings in a position to use their privilege and status to advance the causes of freedom, justice, mercy, and peace, and to speak out not simply about the abuses of our enemies but, far more significantly, about the crimes in which we are implicated and which we can ameliorate or terminate if we choose, how should we think of 9/11? The notion that 9/11 changed the world is widely held, and understandably so. The events of that day certainly had major consequences, domestic and international. One was to lead President Bush to redeclare Reagan's war on terrorism. The first one has been effectively disappeared, to borrow the phrase of our favorite Latin American killers and torturers, presumably because its results did not fit well with our preferred self-image. Another consequence was the invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq, and more recently military interventions in several other countries in the region, as well as regular threats of an attack on Iran. All options are open, in the standard phrase. The costs, in every dimension, have been enormous. That suggests a rather obvious question, asked here not for the first time: was there an alternative? A number of analysts have observed that bin Laden won major successes in his war against the United States. He repeatedly asserted that the only way to drive the U.S. from the Muslim world and defeat its satraps was by drawing Americans into a series of small but expensive wars that would ultimately bankrupt them, the journalist Eric Margolis writes. The United States, first under George W. Bush and then Barack Obama, rushed right into bin Laden's trap. Grotesquely overblown military outlays and debt addiction may be the most pernicious legacy of the man who thought he could defeat the United States. A report from the Costs of War project at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs estimates that the final bill will be $3.2 to $4 trillion. Quite an impressive achievement by bin Laden. That Washington was intent on rushing into bin Laden's trap was evident at once. Michael Scheuer, the senior CIA analyst responsible for tracking bin Laden from 1996 to 1999, wrote, "Bin Laden has been precise in telling America the reasons he is waging war on us." The Al-Qaeda leader, Scheuer continued, was out to drastically alter U.S. and Western policies toward the Islamic world. And, as Scheuer explains, bin Laden largely succeeded. U.S. forces and policies are completing the radicalization of the Islamic world, something Osama bin Laden has been trying to do with substantial but incomplete success since the early 1990s. As a result, I think it is fair to conclude that the United States of America remains bin Laden's only indispensable ally. Arguably, it remains so even after his death. There is good reason to believe that the jihadi movement could have been split and undermined after the 9/11 attack, which was criticized harshly within the movement. Furthermore, that crime against humanity, as it was rightly called, could have been approached as a crime, with an international operation to apprehend the likely suspects. That was recognized in the immediate aftermath of the attack, but no such idea was even considered by decision-makers in Washington. It seems no thought was given to the Taliban's tentative offer, how serious an offer we cannot know, to present the Al-Qaeda leaders for a judicial proceeding. At the time, I quoted Robert Fisk's conclusion that the horrendous crime of 9/11 was committed with wickedness and awesome cruelty, an accurate judgment. The crimes could have been even worse. Suppose that Flight 93, downed by courageous passengers in Pennsylvania, had hit the White House, killing the president. Suppose that the perpetrators of the crime planned to, and did, impose a military dictatorship that killed thousands and tortured tens of thousands. Suppose the new dictatorship established, with the support of the criminals, an international terror center that helped install similar torture and terror states elsewhere, and, as the icing on the cake, brought in a team of economists, call them the Kandahar Boys, who quickly drove the economy into one of the worst depressions in its history. That, plainly, would have been a lot worse than 9/11. As we all should know, this is not a thought experiment. It happened. I am, of course, referring to what in Latin America is often called the First 9/11, September 11, 1973, when the United States succeeded in its intensive efforts to overthrow the democratic government of Salvador Allende in Chile via the military coup that placed General Augusto Pinochet's ghastly regime in office. The dictatorship then installed the Chicago Boys, economists trained at the University of Chicago, to reshape Chile's economy. Consider the economic destruction, the torture and kidnappings, and multiply the numbers killed by 25 to yield per capita equivalents, and you will see just how much more devastating the first 9/11 was. The goal of the overthrow, in the words of the Nixon administration, was to kill the virus that might encourage all those foreigners who are out to screw us by trying to take over their own resources and, more generally, to pursue a policy of independent development along lines disliked by Washington. In the background was the conclusion of Nixon's National Security Council that if the United States could not control Latin America, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world. Washington's credibility would be undermined, as Henry Kissinger put it. The first 9/11, unlike the second, did not change the world. It was nothing of very great consequence, Kissinger assured his boss a few days later. And judging by how it figures in conventional history, his words can hardly be faulted, though the survivors may see the matter differently. These events of little consequence were not limited to the military coup that destroyed Chilean democracy and set in motion the horror story that followed. As already discussed, the first 9/11 was just one act in the drama that began in 1962 when Kennedy shifted the mission of the Latin American militaries to internal security. The shattering aftermath is also of little consequence, the familiar pattern when history is guarded by responsible intellectuals. Intellectuals and their choices. Returning to the two categories of intellectuals, it seems to be close to a historical universal that conformist intellectuals, the ones who support official aims and ignore or rationalize official crimes, are honored and privileged in their own societies, while the value-oriented are punished in one way or another. The pattern goes back to the earliest records. It was the man accused of corrupting the youth of Athens who drank the hemlock, much as Dreyfusards were accused of corrupting souls, and, in due course, society as a whole, and the value-oriented intellectuals of the 1960s were charged with interference with indoctrination of the young. In the Hebrew scriptures there are figures who by contemporary standards are dissident intellectuals, called prophets in the English translation. They bitterly angered the establishment with their critical geopolitical analysis, their condemnation of the crimes of the powerful, their calls for justice and concern for the poor and suffering. King Ahab, the most evil of the kings, denounced the prophet Elijah as a hater of Israel, the first self-hating Jew, or anti-American, in the modern counterparts. The prophets were treated harshly, unlike the flatterers at the court, who would later be condemned as false prophets. The pattern is understandable. It would be surprising if it were otherwise. As for the responsibility of intellectuals, there does not seem to me to be much to say beyond some simple truths. Intellectuals are typically privileged, privilege yields opportunity, and opportunity confers responsibilities. An individual then has choices. Chapter 2, Terrorists Wanted the World Over. On February 13, 2008, Imad Mughniyeh, a senior commander of Hezbollah, was assassinated in Damascus. The world is a better place without this man in it, State Department spokesperson Sean McCormick said. One way or the other he was brought to justice. Director of National Intelligence Mike McConnell added that Mughniyeh had been responsible for more deaths of Americans and Israelis than any other terrorist with the exception of Osama bin Laden. Joy was unconstrained in Israel, too, as one of the U.S. and Israel's most wanted men was brought to justice, the London Finan Times reported. Under the headline, "A Militant Wanted the World Over," an accompanying story reported that Mughniyeh was superseded on the most wanted list by Osama bin Laden after September 11 and so ranked only second among the most wanted militants in the world. The terminology is accurate enough, according to the rules of Anglo-American discourse, which defines the world as the political class in Washington and London, and whoever happens to agree with them on specific matters. It is common, for example, to read that the world fully supported George Bush when he ordered the bombing of Afghanistan. That may be true of the world, but hardly of the world, as revealed in an international Gallup poll after the bombing was announced. Global support was slight. In Latin America, which has some experience with U.S. behavior, support ranged from 2% in Mexico to 16% in Panama, and that support was conditional upon the culprits being identified. They still weren't. 8 months later, the FBI reported, and civilian targets being spared, they were attacked at once. There was an overwhelming preference in the world for diplomatic/judicial measures, rejected out of hand by the world. Following the terror trail. If the world were extended to the world, we might find some other candidates for the honor of most hated arch-criminal. It is instructive to ask why this might be true. The Financial Times reported that most of the charges against Mugniya are unsubstantiated, but one of the very few times when his involvement can be ascertained with certainty, is in the hijacking of a TWA plane in 1985 in which a U.S. Navy diver was killed. This was one of two terrorist atrocities that led newspaper editors, in a poll, to select terrorism in the Middle East as the top story of 1985. The other was the hijacking of the passenger liner Aphil Loro, in which a crippled American, Leon Klinghoffer, was brutally murdered. That reflects the judgment of the world. It may be that the world saw matters somewhat differently. The Aphil Loro hijacking was a retaliation for the bombing of Tunis ordered a week earlier by Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres. Among other atrocities, his air force killed 75 Tunisians and Palestinians with smart bombs that tore them to shreds, as vividly reported from the scene by the prominent Israeli journalist Amnon Kapiliok. Washington cooperated by failing to warn its ally Tunisia that the bombers were on the way, though the Sixth Fleet and U.S. intelligence could not have been unaware of the impending attack. Secretary of State George Shultz informed Israeli Foreign Minister Yitzhak Shamir that Washington had considerable sympathy for the Israeli action, which, to general approbation, he termed a legitimate response to terrorist attacks. A few days later, the UN Security Council unanimously denounced the bombing as an act of armed aggression, with the United States abstaining. Aggression is, of course, a far more serious crime than international terrorism. But giving the United States and Israel the benefit of the doubt, let us keep to the lesser charge against their leadership. A few days after, Peres went to Washington to consult with the leading international terrorist of the day, Ronald Reagan, who denounced the evil scourge of terrorism, again to general acclaim from the world. The terrorist attacks that Shultz and Peres offered as the pretext for the bombing of Tunis were the killings of 3 Israelis in Larnaca, Cyprus. The killers, as Israel conceded, had nothing to do with Tunis, though they might have had Syrian connections. Tunis was a preferable target, however, it was defenseless, unlike Damascus. And there was an extra benefit: more exiled Palestinians could be killed there. The Larnaca killings, in turn, were regarded as retaliation by the perpetrators. They were a response to regular Israeli hijackings in international waters in which many victims were killed, and many more kidnapped, commonly to be held for long periods without charge in Israeli prisons. The most notorious of these prisons has been the secret prison/torture chamber facility 1391. A good deal can be learned about it from the Israeli and foreign press. Such regular Israeli crimes are, of course, known to editors of the national press in the United States, and occasionally receive some casual mention. Klinghoffer's murder was properly viewed with horror and is very famous. It was the topic of an acclaimed opera and a made-for-TV movie, as well as much shocked commentary deploring the savagery of Palestinians, who have variously been deemed two-headed beasts. Prime Minister Menachem Begin, drugged roaches scurrying around in a bottle. Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff Rafal Eitan, like grasshoppers compared to us, whose heads should be smashed against the boulders and walls. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, or, more commonly, just Arabushim, the slang counterpart of kike or nigger. Thus, after a particularly depraved display of settler military terror and purposeful humiliation in the West Bank town of Halhul in December 1982, which disgusted even Israeli hawks, the well-known military/political analyst Yoram Perry wrote in dismay that one task of the army today is to demolish the rights of innocent people just because they are Arabushim living in territories that God promised to us, a task that became far more urgent, and was carried out with far more brutality, when the Arabushim began to raise their heads a few years later. We can easily assess the sincerity of the sentiments expressed about the Klinghoffer murder. It is only necessary to investigate the reaction to comparable US-backed Israeli crimes. Take, for example, the murder in April 2002 of two crippled Palestinians, Kamal Zughair and Jamal Rashid, by Israeli forces rampaging through the refugee camp of Jenin in the West Bank. Zughair's crushed body and the remains of his wheelchair were found by British reporters, along with the remains of the white flag he was holding when he was shot dead while seeking to flee the Israeli tanks which then drove over him, ripping his face in two and severing his arms and legs. Jamal Rashid was crushed in his wheelchair when one of Israel's huge US-supplied Caterpillar bulldozers demolished his home in Jenin with his family inside. The differential reaction, or rather non-reaction, has become so routine and so easy to explain that no further commentary is necessary. Car bombing and terrorist villagers. Plainly, the 1985 Tunis bombing was a vastly more severe terrorist crime than either the Eiffel Loro hijacking or the crime for which Mugnia's involvement can be ascertained with certainty, in the same year. But even the Tunis bombing had competitors for the prize of worst terrorist atrocity in the Mideast in the peak year of 1985. One challenger was a car bombing in Beirut right outside a mosque, timed to go off as worshippers were leaving Friday prayers. It killed 80 people and wounded 256. Most of the dead were girls and women who had been leaving the mosque, though the ferocity of the blast burned babies in their beds, killed a bride buying her trousseau, and blew away 3 children as they walked home from the mosque. It also devastated the main street of the densely populated West Beirut suburb, reported Nora Bustani 3 years later in the Washington Post. The intended target had been the Shiite cleric Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, who escaped. The bombing was carried out by Reagan's CIA and his Saudi allies, with Britain's help, and was specifically authorized by CIA Director William Casey, according to Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward's account in his book Veil, The Safret Wars of the CIA, 1981 to 1987. Little is known beyond the bare facts, thanks to rigorous adherence to the doctrine that we do not investigate our own crimes, unless they become too prominent to suppress, and the inquiry can be limited to some low-level, bad apples, who were, naturally, out of control. A third competitor for the 1985 Mideast Terrorism Prize was Prime Minister Peres's Iron Fist operations in southern Lebanese territories then occupied by Israel in violation of Security Council orders. The targets were what the Israeli High Command called terrorist villagers. Peres's crimes in this case sank to new depths of calculated brutality and arbitrary murder, in the words of a Western diplomat familiar with the area, an assessment amply supported by direct coverage. They are, however, of no interest to the world and therefore remain uninvestigated, in accordance with the usual conventions. We might well ask again whether these crimes fall under international terrorism or the far more severe crime of aggression, but let us once more give the benefit of the doubt to Israel and its backers in Washington and keep to the lesser charge. These are a few of the incidents that might cross the minds of people elsewhere in the world, and considering, one of the very few times Imad Mugnia was clearly implicated in a terrorist crime. The United States also accuses Mugnia of responsibility for devastating double suicide truck bomb attacks on the barracks occupied by U.S. Marines and French paratroopers in Lebanon in 1983, killing 241 Marines and 58 paratroopers, as well as a prior attack on the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63, a particularly serious blow because of a meeting there of CIA officials at the time. The Financial Times has, however, attributed the attack on the Marine barracks to Islamic Jihad, not Hezbollah. Fawaz Gerges, one of the leading scholars on the jihadi movements and on Lebanon, has written that responsibility was taken by an unknown group called Islamic Jihad. A voice speaking in classical Arabic called for all Americans to leave Lebanon or face death. It has been claimed that Mughniya was the head of Islamic Jihad at the time, but to my knowledge, evidence is sparse. The opinion of the world has not been sampled on the subject, but it is possible that there might be some hesitancy about calling an attack on a military base in a foreign country a terrorist attack, particularly when US and French forces were carrying out heavy naval bombardments and airstrikes in Lebanon, and shortly after the United States provided decisive support for the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which killed some 20,000 people and devastated the southern part of the country while leaving much of Beirut in ruins. It was finally called off by President Reagan when international protest became too intense to ignore after the Sabra and Shatila massacres. In the United States, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon is regularly described as a reaction to Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) terrorist attacks on northern Israel from their Lebanese bases, making our crucial contribution to these major war crimes understandable. In the real world, the Lebanese border area had been quiet for a year, apart from repeated Israeli attacks, many of them murderous, in an effort to elicit some PLO response that could be used as a pretext for the already planned invasion. Its actual purpose was not concealed at the time by Israeli commentators and leaders, to safeguard the Israeli takeover of the occupied West Bank. It is of some interest that the sole serious error in Jimmy Carter's book Palestine, P. Not Apartheid is his repetition of this propaganda concoction about PLO attacks from Lebanon being the motive for the Israeli invasion. The book was bitterly attacked, and desperate efforts were made to find some phrase that could be misinterpreted, but this glaring error, the only one, was ignored. Reasonably, since it satisfies the criterion of adhering to useful doctrinal fabrications. Killing without intent. Another allegation is that Mughniya masterminded the bombing of Israel's embassy in Buenos Aires on March 17, 1992, which killed 29 people, in response, as the Financial Times put it, to Israel's assassination of former Hezbollah leader Abbas al-Mazawi in an air attack in southern Lebanon. About the assassination, there is no need for evidence, Israel proudly took credit for it. The world might have some interest in the rest of the story. Al-Mazawi was murdered with a US-supplied helicopter, well north of Israel's illegal security zone in southern Lebanon. He was on his way to Sidon from the village of Jibchit, where he had spoken at the memorial for another imam murdered by Israeli forces. The helicopter attack also killed his wife and 5-year-old child. Israel then employed US-supplied helicopters to attack a car bringing survivors of the first attack to a hospital. After the murder of the family, Hezbollah changed the rules of the game, Yitzhak Rabin informed the Israeli Knesset. Previously, no rockets had been launched at Israel. Until then, the rules of the game had been that Israel could launch murderous attacks anywhere in Lebanon at will, and Hezbollah would respond only within Israeli-occupied Lebanese territory. After the murder of its leader, and his family, Hezbollah began to respond to Israeli crimes in Lebanon by rocketing northern Israel. The latter is, of course, intolerable terror, so Rabin launched an invasion that drove some 500,000 people out of their homes and killed well over 100. The merciless Israeli attacks reached as far as northern Lebanon. In the south, 80% of the city of Tyre fled, and Nabatai was left a ghost town. The village of Jibchit was about 70% destroyed, according to an Israeli army spokesperson, who explained that the intent was to destroy the village completely because of its importance to the Shiite population of southern Lebanon. The general goal was to wipe the villages from the face of the earth and sow destruction around them, as a senior officer of the Israeli Northern Command described the operation. Jibchit may have been a particular target because it was the home of Sheikh Abdul Karim Abaid, kidnapped and brought to Israel several years earlier. Abaid's home received a direct hit from a missile, British journalist Robert Fisk reported, although the Israelis were presumably gunning for his wife and 3 children. Those who had not escaped hid in terror, wrote Mark Nicholson in the Financial Times, because any visible movement inside or outside their houses is likely to attract the attention of Israeli artillery spotters, who were pounding their shells repeatedly and devastatingly into selected targets. Artillery shells were hitting some villages at a rate of more than 10 rounds a minute at times. All of these actions received the firm support of President Bill Clinton, who understood the need to instruct the Arabushim sternly on the rules of the game. And Rabin emerged as another grand hero and a man of peace, so different from the two-legged beasts, grasshoppers, and drugged roaches. The world might find such facts of interest in connection with the alleged responsibility of Mugnia for the retaliatory terrorist act in Buenos Aires. Other charges include that Mugnia helped prepare Hezbollah defenses against the 2006 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, evidently an intolerable terrorist crime by the standards of the world. The more vulgar apologists for U.S. and Israeli crimes solemnly explain that, while Arabs purposely kill civilians, the U.S. and Israel, being democratic societies, do not intend to do so. Their killings are just accidental ones, hence not at the level of moral depravity of their adversaries. That was, for example, the stand of Israel's High Court of Justice when it recently authorized severe collective punishment of the people of Gaza by depriving them of electricity, hence also water, sewage disposal, and other such basics of civilized life. The same line of defense is common with regard to some of Washington's past peccadillos, like the missile attack that in 1998 destroyed the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan. 36 The attack apparently led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, but without intent to kill them, hence it was not a crime on the order of intentional killing. In other words, we can distinguish three categories of crimes: murder with intent, accidental killing, and murder with foreknowledge but without specific intent. Israeli and U.S. atrocities typically fall into the third category. Thus, when Israel destroys Gaza's power supply or sets up barriers to travel in the West Bank, it does not specifically intend to murder the particular people who will die from polluted water or in ambulances that cannot reach hospitals. And when Bill Clinton ordered the bombing of the Al-Shifa plant, it was obvious that it would lead to a humanitarian catastrophe. Human Rights Watch immediately informed him of this, providing details. Nevertheless, he and his advisors did not intend to kill specific people among those who would inevitably die when half the pharmaceutical supplies were destroyed in a poor African country that could not replenish them. Rather, they and their apologists regarded Africans much as we do the ants we crush while walking down a street. We are aware, if we bother to think about it, that it is likely to happen, but we do not intend to kill them because they are not worthy of such consideration. Needless to say, comparable attacks by Arabushim in areas inhabited by human beings are regarded rather differently. If, for a moment, we can adopt the perspective of the world, we might ask which criminals are wanted the world over.